Hey guys, what's up? It's Samantha, and I'm back again with another Plan With Me, where I'm just going to be talking about all the books that I read this week, which was the week of April 27th through May 3rd. Real quick, like I normally do at the beginning of these videos, the kit I'm using is Hello Spring from Scribble Prints Co., and I pulled in a matte green wiggle and then also some gold foil because this was not the first week that I had used that green wiggle and I had run out of pretty much like a lot of the scripts and that sort of thing. But yeah, I also did the half cut headers instead of the bougie boxes. I don't love how it turned out and it took me way longer. I did end up fast forwarding through the day by day a little bit faster. Normally I do that at about 300 and I did it at 400 this time just because it took me a lot longer to get all that down. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into talking about all of the books that I read this week. Like I mentioned last week, I went through a couple week period where I read a bunch of books, and this week was a continuation of that. I did read one really awesome book, but that is at the end of the week, so we're just going to start at the beginning. So this is the week that I started reading Dresden Files. And I will say, before I get into these two books, because you're going to listen to me talk about these books and then wonder how on earth why I continued with the series. I had heard from a lot of people that the first few books weren't that great. And some people said it gets better at book 3. And then other people were saying it gets better at book 4. And some people were saying it gets better at book 6. So I figured I would give it at least 3 books. And if by the end of the 3rd book, I was not remotely interested in it, I was going to pass on the series. And I ended up, spoiler alert, I ended up liking the 3rd book enough. I didn't love it, but I was intrigued enough by where I could see the series going that I decided to stick with it. And I actually have ended up really enjoying the last few installments that I've read. And a lot of the problems I'm going to talk about today are not problems I've had with the series or haven't been as big of an issue to me as a reader as I've gone on with the series and things have generally improved, but did not like the first 2 books in this series very much. So the first book I read this week was Stormfront by Jim Butcher, which was the first Dresden Files book, and I still liked this. I gave it a 3-star. And this just really, it was pretty blah to me. It was entertaining, it was action-packed, it was fun, it was a very easy read. But the way I would describe Harry Dresden, especially in the earlier books, is the wizard version of the Redditor 4chan sort of fedora-wearing basement-dwelling neckbeard stereotype. He literally lives in a basement. And when we walked into his apartment for the first time, I actually laughed out loud because I had been telling my husband that he was a basement-dwelling neckbeard, and then he literally lives in a basement. So I just found Harry to be really insufferable. I know a lot of people really love Harry as a character, and even as I've continued with the series, I actively dislike Harry Dresden, but I love the side characters of this series, and Harry's kind of grown on me a little bit, but I will say there's some issues with women being presented through Harry's eyes. And there isn't a lot of narrative awareness about how cringy Harry's behavior is until the later books. And then it kind of starts to be something that Harry's more aware of, and characters and sort of the way the book is written call out Harry on his bad behavior. He tends to treat women as either sexual objects or infantilizes them. And it's very frustrating, especially in these first 2 books. And I know that part of that is playing into the sort of noir detective stereotype tropes with, the damsel in distress and this hard-boiled gumshoe sort of detective. And I feel like the first couple books played more into that noir thing than the later books do. But anyways, it wasn't as story-breaking for me, the men writing women issues wasn't as story-breaking for me in this first book. It was fun. especially the back half was a lot of fun, this first book. So I was like, okay, I'll continue. Like, not my favorite thing of all time, but I liked it enough. I'll read the second book. And so the next book I read was Full Moon by Jim Butcher. And this, I've been vacillating between like a 1 and a 2. I gave it a 2 initially when I finished it. And then the more I thought about it, the more I actively disliked this book. And I think part of this is, I don't like werewolves. Never liked werewolves. I don't mind if they exist in the background as a thing in the universe, but I don't like werewolves being at the forefront. I felt like this book had so many plots in it, and there have been a couple of the other books that have felt like this to me. Sometimes I feel like there's so many convoluted plots, and Jim Butcher doesn't always tie them together super well. It kind of gives me this feeling of like he threw everything at the wall to see what would stick, and it felt very convoluted. I couldn't keep things straight. I don't know. And then there were also a lot more, the way he treated women in this book bugged me a lot more. And so this is something that's stopped the longer it's gone on, but he repeatedly, some of the descriptions in the books get really repetitive from both book to book and within the book. I know that's a thing. I've heard other fans talk about him and the blue beetle that isn't really blue. And at the beginning of every book, everything is redescribed for you. So when you're reading them consecutively, it feels really repetitive. But something in this book was that everything about Murphy was described as cute or cheerleader. So he would say cute little cheerleader face, cute little cheerleader nose, cute little earlobes, stuff like that. And it just got to be really repetitive because Murphy's this badass woman, and in the first book there was some of the describing her gymnast legs and that kind of stuff, and I think the cute little cheerleader stuff was in the first book, but after reading 2 books of it, I was really sick of the way Murphy was treated in this book, and she isn't treated like this in subsequent books. She stands up for herself more, and Harry is more, I mean, there has been some character development in terms of him not trying to protect Murphy, but she's this really cool kick butt cop, and he doesn't tell her things and ends up getting her into a lot of trouble and putting her in a really dangerous situation because he refuses to communicate what's going on to her, and he lies to her. And everything about this book in terms of character dynamics, I didn't like. I was just so ready for it to be over, and then it felt like it just wouldn't end. And the whole back quarter of the book, I was just like, why isn't this over yet? And I did not like this at all. But I had promised that I was going to read the rest of the series, or not the rest of the series, but at least till book 3. Like I said, book 3, there is a pretty significant shift in terms of acknowledging, instead of framing Harry's chauvinism and quirks around women as a positive or a good thing, he sort of starts recognizing it as a flaw or fault of his, and it's something that he is actively working against. And I don't mind characters having flaws like that. It's just in the first couple books, it's not acknowledged as a flaw. It's treated like he's such a gentleman and he's, such a good guy, such a nice guy, TM, that like everyone says, oh, I'm a nice guy. So I always refer to those kind of characters as nice guy TMs. But yeah, so even though I really, really disliked the first couple books in the series, I ended up really liking it. I'd say by book 3 and 4 were better. And then by book 5, I really started liking the series. So you'll hear about that in the upcoming videos. So then the next book I read was another disappointment. And this was The Shadows Between Us by Tricia Levenseller. I was very excited for this book. If you don't know what this book is, it's a YA romance-centered fantasy story. It's really more a romance than a fantasy, but it was pitched as a Slytherin romance, basically a girl who is very conniving and manipulative, and she wants power, and she is trying to get married to the king so she can assassinate him and take the throne for herself. And I was looking for something. I'm not looking for excellent literature here. I was just looking for a fun time. Maybe something that was sort of like Serpent and Dove, something that is just a fun read. And this is one of my big issues with YA. If you haven't watched my video with me talking about YA stuff, this is a perfect example of something that frustrates me a lot with YA fantasy right now. This book was structured like an adult romance. So even though there's some other, in the synopsis, it makes it sound like the main plot is going to be her trying to assassinate the king, or her falling in love with the king, and then they're trying to stop another assassination plot or something like that. The real main conflict in this book is that these two people want to bang, but they can't for reasons. And I'm not going to get into spoilers or anything for this book, but there's no resolution of that on page. And yes, there are YA books that show sex on page, but here we get the foreplay, we get conversations that are pretty sexually explicit, where they're talking about their sexual experiences. You know, neither of these people are virgins. They're both over 18. There's really no reason this couldn't have been an adult fantasy romance. That is how this book was structured. And then we get to the end, and there's no resolution to any of this tension that's built up on page, because there ends up being no sex on page. Like, you find out they had sex, but it's not on page. And I'm not just saying this like, ooh, I want to, read the steamy scenes. But when you're reading a romance, certain books, maybe it's building up to a kiss, or building up to a proposal, or building up to these two people realizing they have feelings for each other. But in this book, from the get-go, it's pretty much building, or from very early on in the story, it's building up to them wanting to have sex. And then you don't ever get that resolution on page. And it just felt blah, like it really fell flat for me. So this wasn't a terrible book. I think this would have been a better book if it had just recognized that it was an adult fantasy romance and just had written the adult fantasy romance book that I think she was trying to write, instead of cutting out the explicit sex scene and making it YA. There were parts of this that were really fun. And no, is it quality, like, classic literature? No, but I read for escapism and fun too, and this could have just been a really fun book, and it wasn't. And I was very disappointed by it. So I gave it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. I just really wish that books like this would get published as adults, so they could just be the adult books that they're actually trying to be. Because it also was sexual enough and explicit enough and zesty enough in the conversation that I would feel weird recommending it to anyone at work under the age of 16. Not saying that a 15 or 14-year-old couldn't pick this up and read this. If someone asks for something, I always give it to them. But I feel weird recommending younger teens books that are very flippant about talking about sex, or are very sexy in terms of content. And this book has very intense sexual vibes, even though there's no sex on page, there's such a disconnect between content and tone. I don't know, just very frustrating. And then the last book I read, which was a 4.5 out of 5 stars, finally a good book, was Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. And I really, really loved this book. The only reason this wasn't a 5-star, everything about this was perfect. Magical, wonderful, the atmosphere, great. I loved all the social commentary. I loved the way the fairy tale elements were used to just everything came together in such a beautifully wonderful, fulfilling way. My only reason this wasn't a 5-star book was that I am not gonna lie, I had trouble with the point of view changes, especially like that point of views were introduced and not explained. Like all of a sudden a third point of view shows up after the first, quarter or third of the book is between Miriam and I can't remember anyone's name. I'm really bad with book name characters. I'm shocked that I even remember Miriam. But when they introduce the princess character, or I don't remember if she was actually a princess, but the wealthy royalty, nobility kind of girl character, there's no explanation that this is a new point of view and you're just thrown into it. And none of the point of view changes are labeled with the character. And sometimes it was really disconcerting and I couldn't tell who was speaking. And that was very, very frustrating. And sometimes I'd have to go back and start sections over again because I'd get into it and then realize that I had been thinking it was someone else or I didn't know who it was, and now things made sense, so I went back. That was my only issue with this book. I will say some of the voices sounded very similar, but then there were ones that were done really, really well. Like one of the younger brothers of the girl whose name I can't remember now. Was it Stepan or was that the older brother? I can't remember. I'm really bad with names, so I apologize. But he is sort of coded as being autistic or not neurotypical, and the way his narrative is written is very different than everyone else's. The language that's used and run-on sentences, and so he both sounds like a younger child, the way kids talk, and also some of his, like, with not being neurotypical / I'm guessing it seems like he's coded to be autistic. That comes across in the way he's written really, really well. And I loved how his character was reflected in the way he spoke. But then other characters sounded exactly the same and their narrative style wasn't different at all. That is the only thing. I've talked about this for something that I loved this book. I loved this book so much. It was so magical and so beautiful, but I wish she had just put the characters' names at the top of the section, and every time a POV changed, just list the character's name. It's really not that hard to do. That, and maybe that was a publisher choice, maybe that was an editor choice. I don't know, but that was my only pet peeve with this book, and I know for some people that is a bigger issue than it was for me. I know some people have dinged the book more for that, but that seemed to be a common issue when I was reading through other Goodreads reviews, because I was like, am I the only person that can't tell people apart? No. So yeah, that was everything that I read this week. I think the week after this, books started getting better again, if I'm remembering correctly, but just had a weird stretch of books that I didn't really love in there. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I've really appreciated the overwhelmingly positive feedback I've gotten from you guys about me sharing my love of books on this channel and letting my love of planners overlap with my love of books. So again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will talk to you in my next one. Bye guys.